What happens when a black woman, holding a valid first-class ticket, is told she doesn't belong by someone who has no idea she's a federal investigator? At Westbridge International Airport, a quiet act of discrimination unfolds at the gate. But what the airline didn't realize was that the woman they tried to dismiss wasn't just another passenger. She was there to observe, to report, and to hold the system accountable. The overhead screen at gate C14 displayed First Class, Group 1 now boarding in soft blue letters. A line had begun to form, short and orderly, as travelers adjusted their carry-ons and scanned their phones. Among them was Imani Carter, a 29-year-old black woman dressed in tailored navy slacks and a beige blouse, standing calmly with her boarding pass in hand. Her expression was composed, almost unreadable, but her eyes were alert, trained, observant. She wasn't just a passenger. She was an undercover inspector with the FAA, assigned to observe flight operations on a commercial route from Westbridge International Airport to Dallas. The details of her work were known only to a handful of supervisors. To everyone else, she was just another traveler with a first-class seat, 2A. Imani stepped forward when the agent gestured for the next person in line. She handed over her phone with a quiet, "Good morning." The gate agent didn't smile. Her name tag read, Heather Dawson. Her tone was clipped, her movements mechanical. She glanced at the screen, then up at Imani. Without scanning the pass, Heather frowned. "Group 3 hasn't been called yet," she said. Imani responded politely. "I'm in first-class seat 2A. Heather's eyes flicked back to the screen, then to Imani's face again. "This is priority boarding," she said, her voice lower now. "You need to move to the economy line." There was a subtle shift in the air around them. Conversations paused. A few passengers nearby looked up, then quickly away. No one said a word. Imani didn't raise her voice. "I believe priority boarding was just called, and this pass clearly states 2A first class." Heather's lips thinned. She still hadn't scanned the ticket. Instead, she stared at it, as if searching for a reason to deny it. A silent message lingered in her posture. "You don't belong here." Imani stood her ground. Her voice was steady, calm. "Would you mind scanning it?" Heather hesitated, then finally raised the scanner. A mechanical beep followed, and the green light blinked. The boarding pass was valid exactly as Imani had said. Heather stepped aside without a word. Imani offered a brief nod and walked past her. There was no apology, no correction, just silence. As she moved down the jet bridge, Imani felt the familiar weight settle in her chest. She had followed every rule, paid the full fare, arrived on time. And still she had been challenged. But this time it wasn't just personal, it was professional. Heather Dawson had no idea who she had just tried to stop. No idea that the woman she had quietly dismissed was carrying federal credentials and would be writing a report by the end of the day. And somewhere in that report, there would be a section marked Gate Agent Interaction Observation Noted. The hum of the jet bridge was low and steady as Imani Carter stepped onto the aircraft. She moved with the calm precision of someone accustomed to turbulence not in the air, but in the world around her. Behind her, passengers continued to line up, the murmurs of boarding announcements trailing off like background noise. But her mind was elsewhere. She had said nothing at the gate, had not raised her voice, had not shown her badge, had not reminded Heather Dawson who she really was, not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. Revealing her role as an FAA inspector would have shifted the moment's balance of power. It would have forced compliance, forced civility. But Imani didn't want forced respect. Not today. Today, she wanted to see how far it would go. She turned into the first-class cabin, offered a quiet "thank you" to the smiling flight attendant, and slid into seat 2A, a window seat, second row. The leather was cool, the armrest still untouched. She placed her tote beneath the seat in front of her and folded her coat neatly over her lap. Outside, a ground crew vehicle zipped past. Inside, a businessman was settling into 2B next to her, too busy with his phone to notice anything else, which was just as well. Imani sat still, her body upright, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Her jaw was tight, but her face remained composed. This wasn't new. It never happened with shouting, rarely with slurs. It was subtle. A pause too long before service. A look that lingered just enough to question. A smile reserved for someone else. The disbelief that someone like her, young, black, alone, could belong in a seat like this. And yet she did. Every part of her itinerary was legitimate. Every mile earned, every credential checked, every assignment cleared. She had spent years working for the FAA, conducting inspections on regional airlines and major carriers alike. Quiet work, invisible work, necessary work. And today, that work had already begun before the plane had even left the ground. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a slim notepad, the kind she always carried. Without writing anything yet, she opened it to a blank page and stared at it for a few seconds. Gate C-14 Westbridge Intel. Interaction. Boarding denial without cause. She would complete the note later. Official documentation had a process, but the facts were already clear in her mind. No apology had been offered. No explanation either, just resistance, followed by reluctant acceptance once the scanner forced the truth. Heather Dawson likely assumed that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Imani closed the notepad, placed it beside her, and adjusted her seatbelt. The boarding process continued in the background. She heard the familiar cadence of overhead bins opening and closing, passengers murmuring about carry-ons, a flight attendant reminding someone about tray tables. She had seen it all before. But what stayed with her, what lodged beneath the surface like a splinter, wasn't the boarding pass or the gate agent's tone. It was the silence of the crowd, the way no one else had said anything. No one had intervened, not even the man standing behind her in line. Perhaps they didn't know what to say. Perhaps they didn't think it mattered. But it did. And if today unfolded the way she expected, it was going to matter more than they realized. The boarding door had just closed when the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling that departure was near. A soft chime sounded overhead. Passengers shifted in their seats, some already reaching for headphones, others scrolling through their phones. Imani Carter sat motionless in 2A, her tray table up, seatbelt fastened, posture alert. Then came the voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm Captain Brett Lawson. We've been alerted to a minor mechanical issue. Nothing serious, but out of an abundance of caution, we'll be pausing departure while our ground technicians take a closer look. We appreciate your patience." The announcement was calm, professional, exactly what it should be. But Imani knew better than to dismiss it as routine. Her eyes flicked to the front of the cabin. Through the partially open cockpit door, she caught a glimpse of movement. Moments later, a maintenance technician stepped on board wearing a reflective vest, a tablet in hand. His pace was brisk but controlled. He exchanged a few quiet words with the lead flight attendant, then disappeared into the cockpit. From her vantage point, Imani couldn't hear the specifics. But she didn't need to, not yet. Instead, she observed. The man in 2B beside her sighed audibly and began texting someone, likely lamenting a delay. A few rows back, an elderly couple exchanged concerned glances. A toddler began to fuss somewhere in coach. The tension in the cabin, though subtle, began to ripple outward, but Imani remained still. Her fingers slid once more into her blazer pocket, finding the edge of her FAA credentials. She didn't remove them. Not yet. She wasn't here to disrupt. She was here to verify. Every FAA field agent was trained to respond to onboard mechanical issues, not by interfering, but by watching, listening, assessing whether the airline's response matched its protocol. Imani had done this many times, sometimes discovering nothing, other times uncovering shortcuts taken under pressure. She glanced at the flight attendants. Their faces remained composed, but their eyes were alert. The crew wasn't panicked. That was a good sign. Still, Imani knew how quickly a routine procedure could spiral into a rushed decision, especially under tight schedules. She leaned back, her mind working through the possibilities. A faulty sensor, an electrical reading, a pre-flight discrepancy. None of it sounded catastrophic, but that wasn't the point. Small lapses in standard procedure could reveal larger problems underneath. Imani's job was to ensure that didn't happen, not on this flight, not on any. The technician exited the cockpit a few minutes later and walked back toward the cabin door, likely stepping off to access tools or coordinate with the tarmac crew. Imani tracked his movement carefully, noting his posture, his pace, his expressions. Nothing erratic, no visible signs of urgency. Still, she made a mental note of the time elapsed since the captain's announcement. In her mind, she began building a silent checklist. Captain announcement, maintenance response, in progress, passenger handling, professional crew communication, steady FAA intervention, not yet necessary. The aircraft remained parked at the gate. Outside, through the oval window, she could see the technician in conversation with another ground crew member, both pointing toward the nose of the plane, likely a sensor or systems check. Imani folded her hands in her lap and exhaled slowly. This delay wasn't an inconvenience, it was an opportunity, a chance to observe under pressure, to see how the system functioned when the timeline tightened and tensions rose. The others in the cabin were frustrated. She understood that. But while they stared at their screens and refreshed departure times, Imani Carter had already switched modes. The passenger was still in the seat, but the inspector had just taken over. The aircraft remained still at gate C-14. Outside, the technician conferred with ground personnel. Inside, the cabin buzzed with quiet restlessness, pages turning, shoes shifting, sighs released into the recycled air. Imani Carter stayed in her seat, watching, calculating. Then, as he passed through the first-class cabin offering bottled water and polite reassurance, flight attendant Marcus Liu slowed slightly beside her row. He didn't speak at first, just paused, then leaned in a fraction, voice lowered. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "I noticed what happened at the gate." Imani turned to meet his eyes. Marcus's tone was professional, but something in his face, part concern, part quiet regret, made her pause. "She shouldn't have spoken to you like that," he continued. "Heather, that wasn't right." Imani gave a single nod. She didn't speak. She wanted to hear what he'd say unprompted. "She's had complaints before," Marcus added. "I've seen her brush off elderly passengers. One time she told a young mother she'd better get it together because her toddler was crying." He exhaled, then added, "Honestly, I'm surprised she's still assigned to front-facing work." Imani studied him for a second. He wasn't just trying to be kind. He was telling the truth and maybe protecting himself too. "I appreciate your honesty," she said calmly. "Thank you." Marcus nodded and moved on, returning to the galley. Imani looked forward. She didn't like involving her title unless necessary, but this morning had already crossed 2 lines, one at the gate, one on the tarmac. Now came the third. Imani unfastened her seatbelt and stood. With slow, deliberate steps, she moved toward the cockpit, waiting just outside the partially closed door. Marcus returned, surprised to see her up. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" She held his gaze. "Could you let the captain know I'd like to speak with him?" Discreetly. Marcus blinked, then gave a small nod. "Of course." A moment later, the cockpit door eased open. Captain Brett Lawson, a tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and an efficient, no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out. "Something I can help you with, miss?" he asked. Imani didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture. She simply reached into her blazer and retrieved a small, leather-bound ID case. She flipped it open just enough for the captain to see the seal. Federal Aviation Administration Field Operations Division. Brett Lawson's expression shifted. Not alarm, but something close to recalibration. He cleared his throat. "I'm on assignment," Imani said softly. "Unannounced. And I'd like to quietly observe the mechanical inspection process from this point forward. Given the delay and the current conditions, I believe it falls within my discretion." The captain nodded slowly, eyes scanning the ID again. "Understood," he said, voice quieter now. "Sensor malfunction, we caught it during final checks. Maintenance is trying to confirm whether it's a faulty reading or an actual issue with the flap system." "I appreciate your transparency," she replied. "Let's keep this between us and your crew for now. No need for passengers to know anything more than they already do." "Yes, ma'am," the captain said. "You'll have access." He gestured toward the galley jump seat for her to wait, while the technician prepared to reboard. As she moved toward the designated area, Imani didn't look back. She wasn't here to embarrass anyone. She was here to watch to make sure no corner was cut, no risk minimized, no system rushed for convenience. This wasn't personal anymore. This was federal oversight, and the real inspection had just begun. The air on the jet bridge was noticeably cooler than inside the cabin, a quiet corridor between routine and responsibility. Imani Carter stood near the aircraft door, arms loosely folded, her FAA identification now visible and clipped discreetly to the inside of her lapel. She had no intention of drawing attention, but here, formality had its place. The lead maintenance technician arrived moments later, tablet in hand, safety vest still dusted with engine grime. He was in his late 30s, Korean-American, with steady eyes and a calm, unhurried demeanor. "Daniel Kim," he introduced, offering a nod instead of a handshake. "Lead tech, contracted through Aeroserve for this route." "Imani Carter," she replied evenly. "FAA Field Inspector. I'd like to review the diagnostic logs before you close this out." Daniel didn't flinch. "Of course, it's right here." He turned the tablet toward her. The interface was familiar basic flight data modules, sensor panels, fault histories. Imani scanned the screen with practiced eyes. "Fault code 743D, Daniel noted. External flap sensor reading out of range, but no duplication in backup indicators. Visual inspection shows no irregularities on the control surfaces. Imani nodded as she tapped through the sequence. The system had flagged the left side trailing flap sensor, but the backup system hadn't mirrored the error, and the flight computer had auto-isolated the fault. Still, standard protocol required confirmation before override. Was the flap cycle tested manually? She asked. Full extension and retraction twice. We also confirmed indicator light behavior in the cockpit during test run. Hydraulic pressure? Within nominal range, he said. No lag on flap return. Imani paused. She wasn't looking for drama. She wasn't hoping for a major violation. She was here to see whether a minor issue would be treated with the seriousness it deserved or brushed off under the pressure of the clock. So far, everything Daniel reported aligned with proper protocol. She glanced back toward the aircraft, where boarding was paused and the crew was holding calmly. No one had rushed her. No one had tried to minimize her role. Any override requested? She asked. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Captain Lawson said he'd wait until I signed off and you were satisfied. Imani respected that. Too often she had witnessed flight crews push to close doors and depart before paperwork was complete. Lawson was playing it by the book. Have you logged the diagnostic capture? She asked. Yes, Daniel confirmed, tapping the icon to show her the time-stamped record. She gave a final nod. Then I'm satisfied. Proceed with sensor override protocol and manual sign-off. No further delay unless something changes. Daniel keyed in the last few steps, then turned the tablet back toward himself. Appreciate your time, he said sincerely. Most folks from the FAA don't step in this precisely. Imani gave a faint smile. Most passengers don't see what I see either. She stepped back into the aircraft as he returned to ground ops. The inspection was routine. The paperwork would be clean, but the morning's events were far from forgettable. Imani's mental checklist, once narrow and technical, was beginning to widen. Fault response procedure, compliant, light crew, coordination, compliant, gate, interaction under review, pattern of staff, conduct, under observation. The sensor may have been faulty, but the warning signs in this system extended beyond electronics. The aircraft leveled out at cruising altitude. Outside the window of seat 2A, clouds stretched in quiet layers, soft and blinding white. Inside the cabin, the tone had shifted. The tension from the delay had ebbed into normalcy. The seatbelt sign was off. Trays came down. Coffee orders resumed. Imani Carter took a slow breath and exhaled. Her posture remained upright, but her expression had softened into focus. Now came the second part of her task. Unclipping her pen discreetly from her blazer, Imani reached for her notepad, plain, unmarked, and always kept close. With practiced calm, she began her mid-flight inspection, conducted entirely from her seat and quiet movements around the cabin. This was never about poking through compartments or drawing attention. It was about observing details others missed. When the flight attendants passed, she noted their tone, posture, the way they addressed passengers. Marcus Liu, who had approached her earlier, moved through the aisle with poise and patience. He kneeled beside an older woman to help with her reading light. He smiled at a young mother traveling with a fussy toddler. He asked if anyone needed help with their devices before beverage service began. Professional. Calm. Exactly how the front line of any airline should look. Imani gave him quiet credit in her notes. Then came the turbulence. Nothing extreme, just a firm shake and a jolt that sent a few drinks sloshing in plastic cups. The captain's voice crackled overhead, reassuring passengers to return their seatbacks and buckle up. Imani watched the crew's response carefully. They moved quickly, efficiently. No panic. Marcus checked row by row, his expression unchanged, his voice still warm. Imani jotted down a line. Cabin crew response under turbulence. Composed, clear, communicative. But even as she wrote, her mind drifted backward, not to the air, but to the gate. Heather Dawson's face returned to her thoughts, not as a person, but as a symbol. A small decision, wrapped in a cold glance, backed by silence. That moment, though brief, revealed something deeper than bad customer service. It revealed bias, quiet, practiced, and familiar. Imani looked around the cabin. Every seat was full now. Most passengers had likely forgotten the delay, the malfunction, even the name of the gate agent. But not Imani. She hadn't forgotten the tone. The pause before scanning. The assumption behind the words, "You're not in this line." It wasn't the first time. And if patterns held, it wouldn't be the last. But today, unlike so many others, Imani had the tools to do something about it. Not to punish out of emotion, but to expose behavior that systems too often protect. Her inspection report wouldn't just list the sensor reading or flap response. It would also include a line item about the human element. Passenger treatment observed during boarding anomaly noted. Gate agent interaction potentially indicative of discriminatory bias. Recommended for compliance review. She didn't need to shout it, she just needed to document it clearly, precisely, professionally. Because even at 30,000 feet, where the world seemed silent and smooth, truth had weight, and today it was flying with her. The wheels touched down smoothly on the runway at Dallas-Fort Worth, a subtle bounce followed by the reassuring thrum of engines reversing. The aircraft slowed, exited the runway, and taxied toward the terminal as passengers stirred from the quiet stillness of descent. Imani Carter remained in her seat, calm as ever, though her thoughts were active. The mechanical issue had been handled properly, the flight crew had met every standard. But one part of the morning remained unresolved, not technical, but personal. She retrieved her tote from beneath the seat and stood when the chime signaled disembarkation. As the line shuffled slowly forward, a familiar figure came into view at the end of the jet bridge. Heather Dawson. Still in uniform, now stationed outside the door to assist with arrival logistics. Her posture was different, no longer stiff, but tentative. As Imani approached, their eyes met for the first time since that moment at gate C-14. Heather stepped forward slightly, her voice lowered. "Miss, I just wanted to say about earlier, I didn't mean—" Imani held her gaze, expression unreadable. She didn't offer hostility, just clarity. "I had a valid first-class ticket," she said evenly. There was no confusion. Heather's mouth opened, then closed. She gave a small nod. "Right, I understand." Imani said nothing more. She stepped past, pulling her bag behind her. It was not about revenge, not even about anger anymore. It was about record, pattern, accountability. She exited the jet bridge and entered the bright terminal. The world resumed its motion voices, rolling suitcases, digital signs announcing connections. She walked toward baggage claim with quiet intention. Halfway down the corridor, someone fell into step beside her. "Excuse me, Miss Carter." She turned. It was the man from 2B. Ryan Whitaker, she recalled mid-30s, business casual, sharp but approachable. "I hope I'm not overstepping," he said gently. "I was standing behind you at the gate. I saw what happened." Imani didn't respond immediately. She waited. Ryan continued, his tone respectful. "I didn't say anything at the time. Honestly, I didn't know if I should. But I want to say now it wasn't right." Imani gave a small nod, appreciative but cautious. "I just wanted to encourage you," Ryan added. "If there's a way to report it, you should. You have every right to be treated with respect. It matters." He wasn't preaching. He wasn't trying to save face. He looked uncomfortable but sincere. Imani glanced around the same airport, the same kind of silence that had followed her at the gate. But this time, someone had spoken up. She offered a measured response. "I'm handling it, thank you." Ryan nodded. "Good, I'm glad." He gave a slight smile, then peeled off toward the car service pickup zone. Imani continued walking, her pace unhurried. But something in her chest had shifted. Her report would go in. But now she understood something deeper. This wasn't just about her own mistreatment. It wasn't even just about Heather. It was about every silent moment people had chosen not to challenge. Every passenger who'd said nothing. Every employee who had noticed but looked the other way. One voice could begin something, but enough voices, written down, recorded, reviewed, that could change how the system behaved. She reached for her phone, opened a secure notes app, and began typing. Gate number, timestamp, interaction, tone, witness remarks. The flight was over, but the process had just begun. The baggage carousel whirred to life, rotating slowly under fluorescent lights. A dull announcement echoed overhead, blending into the shuffle of rolling suitcases and soft conversations. Imani Carter stood a few steps back from the crowd, her hands resting lightly on the handle of her bag. The terminal buzzed with travelers moving on to the next part of their day, but Imani was still piecing together what the morning had meant. Her notes were written. The incident was documented. The facts were clear. But the why she needed to file this report was still settling. Then, through the crowd, she recognized a familiar face. It was the young father from Coach, the one she'd seen boarding earlier with two small children in tow. He stood by the carousel, trying to keep one child from climbing onto the rubber belt while the other tugged on his arm. He looked up, spotted Imani, and offered a tired smile. She stepped closer. "Long day?" she asked gently. He chuckled, shifting his backpack. "Every day's a long day when you travel with kids." Amani smiled, then nodded toward the carousel. "Delayed bags too?" "Of course," he said with a sigh. "I think it's the universe's way of building character." There was a pause, easy, natural. Then he lowered his voice slightly. "I saw what happened earlier," he said. "At the gate." Amani met his eyes. He didn't look angry, just worn. "I didn't know what to say," he continued. "Didn't want to cause a scene, but I want you to know it wasn't just you." Amani stayed quiet. She let him speak. "When I asked the gate agent Heather, I think, about early boarding with my kids, she gave me a look like I'd asked for a private jet, told me to get in line like everyone else, even though the airline policy says families with young kids board early." He glanced toward his children, then back at her. "I've flown a lot," he added. "I've had rough days, but this one felt different. She was dismissive, like we were bothering her just by existing." Amani felt her jaw tighten, not in anger, but in recognition. "Did you say anything to customer service?" she asked. He shook his head. "What's the point? They'll say sorry and send a coupon, if I even get that." Amani looked down, then back at him. "You're probably right," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be documented." He studied her for a moment. "Are you someone who can do that?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Trevor Ellis, she would later write his name down, nodded, as if that small admission lifted something off his shoulders. "Well," he said, managing a tired smile, "then I'm glad you were on our flight." Their bags arrived moments later, tumbling down together. Amani retrieved hers, thanked him quietly, and walked toward the terminal exit. This wasn't about one boarding pass anymore. It was about the accumulation of silence, of people brushed aside just enough to feel it, but not enough to fight it. Trevor had stayed quiet. So had others. But Amani wouldn't. She would file her report, not for revenge, but because patterns only become visible when someone connects the voices. And today, she was listening. By 8 a.m. the following morning, Amani Carter stood at a secured checkpoint near Gate D6, her FAA credentials once again clipped to her blazer. The atmosphere was different today. No tote bag, no boarding pass, no pretense. She wasn't blending in anymore. Beside her stood Alicia Monroe, a senior compliance director from the FAA's regional Dallas office, and Nathan Crowley, a quiet but methodical field investigator known for spotting operational lapses others missed. They had reviewed Amani's preliminary notes and made one decision: a surprise inspection of the airline's morning procedures, not just the mechanical side. Passenger handling, staff training, human factors. Alicia leaned toward her. "Gate 21 has a heavy departure this hour. Priority and international mix." Nathan tapped his tablet. "Flight 762 to Los Angeles. Let's begin there." They moved toward the concourse, and as they approached the gate podium, Amani slowed. There, in a crisp navy uniform, hair pulled back just like yesterday, was Heather Dawson. Amani blinked. For a brief second, she wondered if it was coincidence or consequence. Had Heather been reassigned to another gate? Or had someone quietly moved her, hoping a new location might mask the previous day's misstep? If so, it hadn't worked. Heather spotted the trio instantly. Her expression didn't flinch, but Amani saw the flicker of tension in her hands as she adjusted a stack of boarding passes. Alicia stepped forward first, her tone neutral but authoritative. "Good morning. We're with the FAA. Conducting a procedural compliance check on behalf of the Passenger Experience Division. We'd like to observe your boarding process today." Heather nodded quickly. "Of course. Happy to assist." Everything about her voice was different, measured, polite, overly polished. She greeted each passenger with a textbook smile. Her posture was perfect. Her announcements were clear. Every gesture seemed to come from a training video. Amani watched in silence. To a casual observer, Heather was exemplary. But to Amani, the shift was too sudden, too rehearsed. This wasn't consistency. It was correction. A performance put on under pressure. Nathan whispered quietly beside her, "She's overcompensating." Amani nodded. "She knows." The inspection continued. They observed interactions with a young couple whose tickets had been mistyped. Heather corrected the issue swiftly and with unusual kindness. A man who tried to cut into the priority line was redirected politely but firmly. Even passengers needing wheelchair assistance were greeted with warmth. On paper, it was perfect. But Amani wasn't interested in paper. She was watching the edges, the pauses, the breath catches, the moments where instinct would normally take over. Heather was calculating each step, and that meant she knew what she had done before. After boarding, Alicia asked to review recent gate agent training logs. Heather provided the digital records, annual diversity modules, conflict de-escalation videos, and optional refreshers on priority boarding policies. Optional. Amani raised an eyebrow. Nathan spoke up, his tone calm. How often do agents receive direct feedback on behavior from passengers? Heather hesitated. Only if someone files a formal complaint. And are those shared with you? Amani asked, voice level. Not always, Heather admitted. It depends. They made their notes. Weak spots in protocol weren't always about what was taught, it was what wasn't enforced. As the team concluded the observation, Alicia leaned toward Amani and spoke just loud enough for the others to hear. Everything looks polished today, but polish without consistency is just theater. Amani nodded once. They had seen enough. The data they'd collected wouldn't just cover Heather Dawson. It would reflect a larger issue, a system trained to perform, but not to reflect. And a culture more concerned with appearances under pressure than accountability and silence. 2 weeks later, a formal memo was issued by the airline's corporate office. It was brief, clinical in tone, but clear in its message. Effective immediately, gate agent Heather Dawson has been placed on administrative leave pending review of multiple conduct-related incidents. Accompanying that announcement was something far more significant, a company-wide directive outlining new, mandatory reforms to gate agent operations. Training modules on racial bias, inclusive communication, and accountability protocols would no longer be optional. They would be required, measured, audited. For most passengers, it passed as just another headline in their inbox. But for Amani Carter, it meant something deeper. She didn't read the memo with a sense of victory. There was no joy in seeing someone removed from their post. No satisfaction in someone else's name landing in an internal investigation. Accountability for her was never about humiliation. It was about course correction. Quietly, firmly, and when necessary, publicly. She sat in her office at the FAA Regional Field Branch in Dallas, looking out the window at a taxiing aircraft in the distance. On her desk sat a slim folder, her final report on Flight 762, complete with technical assessments, behavioral observations, and a closing recommendation that had sparked the inspection in the first place. The case was technically closed. The flight had landed safely. No passenger was harmed. No federal violations uncovered. And yet, something had shifted. Amani reflected on the sequence, not just Heather's refusal to scan her boarding pass, but the silence that had followed. The weariness in Trevor Ellis's voice, the hesitation in Ryan Whitaker's tone, even Marcus Liu's quiet confession, whispered between service routines. No single act had screamed injustice, but taken together, they formed a pattern, a quiet erosion of dignity, repeated just enough to become invisible to those not on the receiving end. Imani had seen enough of these patterns to know they were rarely intentional, but that was never an excuse. She picked up her notepad and flipped through the final pages. A few lines stood out in neat handwriting. Discrimination doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a pause before a scan, as a silence when a voice is needed, as a pattern that only the affected can trace. There was still so much more to do. More airports, more agents, more systems that needed watching. But this flight had done what it needed to do. It had sent a message through the chain of command that appearances could no longer outweigh substance, and that FAA oversight wasn't limited to engines and emergency slides. It extended to people, to policies, to how a traveler is made to feel the moment they walk toward a boarding gate. Imani closed the folder. She didn't know where the next flight would lead, but she knew this much. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a long-haul journey measured in conversations, reports, policy shifts, and small moments of resistance that no one else would see. And this time she hadn't just watched it unfold. She'd helped it take off. Injustice doesn't always wear a badge or shout through a megaphone. Sometimes it whispers through a pause at the boarding gate, a silent assumption, a look that says, "You don't belong here." But when someone like Amani Carter chooses not to respond with outrage but with record-keeping, professionalism, and persistence, something powerful happens. The system, for once, is forced to look inward. This wasn't just about a boarding pass. It was about every silent moment so many passengers have endured, and a reminder that dignity isn't a privilege. It's a right. If this story moved you, if you've ever witnessed quiet injustice or carried it in silence like this video to show your support, share it so others can see what accountability truly looks like. Comment below if you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story that dares to speak where others stay silent. Together, let's keep these stories flying until justice doesn't need a badge to be recognized.